Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if you're new to the channel, well, you picked a great day to pop along because it's the A to ZX of the Spectrum, that's right. This guy comes back out and we play 5 more games now. We're on to the letter Q this weekend.
That's Q! The letter Q, that's Q! The letter Q, that's Q!
I was quite surprised I could manage to find 5 games worth playing with the letter Q at the start. But you know what? I think I've managed it, so if you want to see these 8-bit microcomputer classics, well, you just wait until after the titles. First up for the letter Q, we're going to have Quarterback, which was published by Virgin in 1990. Now it was also titled as John Elway's Quarterback, but that's beside the point. Now as I said, this game was released in 1990, and don't get me wrong, but despite being quite playable, well, by the time the ZX Spectrum got to the 90s, well, it was definitely starting to show its age quite a bit. Now of course this particular game was released in many other systems, mostly 8-bit microcomputers, but also on the NES, and although the gameplay is quite solid and fairly similar across all the different formats, you can see quite clearly that the ZX Spectrum's graphical presentation of the game, well, especially on the pitch, was really starting to lag behind the other systems that were already on the market. Now of course, control wise it was absolutely fine. You could of course use a joystick or, like myself, use the keyboard, and it only required the 5 buttons. That was up, down, left, right and a fire button. And despite the aging graphics of the ZX Spectrum, well, it was still fairly easy to discern which member of the team you were taking control of and what the two opposite teams were. Of course, to get around the ZX Spectrum's famous colour clash, they stuck to a fairly monochromatic theme. The players on the pitch were just outline drawings of the characters, and all the colour in the game was dedicated to the pitch itself. And when it came to the tactics of the game, well, it was exactly the same as it was in any other system. You had 9 offensive plays that were mostly passing plays, and 6 defensive plays. And on the whole, it was a really solid port of the game. But as I said at the beginning, the ZX Spectrum was really getting on in age by the time you got to 1990. So playing a game like this on the Nintendo Entertainment System was, well, it was a much better option back then. But as a Spectrum game, would I recommend it today? Well, absolutely, because not only was it 1 player against a computer, you could also have a 2-player game against a friend. So absolutely, if you get the opportunity and you fancy playing this game in an old 8-bit microcomputer, well, the ZX Spectrum's not a bad system to play this game on. And that's Quarterback, published by Virgin Media in 1990. Second up for the letter Q, we're going to look at Q10 Tank Buster, which was released in 1992 by Zeppelin Games, and it was also released on the Amstrad CPC the year before, and the same year for the Commodore 64. Now as you can see, this is a side-scrolling horizontal shooter, and I tell you what, this was one of the better ones in the ZX Spectrum. Now to be fair, it was released in 1992, so it was a very late release game for the system. But let's not take anything away from the game, because the scrolling in this game was, well, it was near perfection for a ZX Spectrum. And also the speed of the game, considering how many different sprites and how many different elements were all interacting on the screen at one time, well, it was quite astounding for the Spectrum. Of course, they used the old trick of the monochromatic display because, well, the colour clash would have been awful in this game, as we've seen in previous games. And also, it's not the full screen that gets the gameplay. To get as much out of the gameplay as they possibly could, well, the bottom half of the screen was a cockpit view. An interesting enough graphic so it didn't look awful, but cutting down on that gameplay screen just so they could make it run as fast as it could with as much going on as they could possibly fit into this game. And compared to earlier shooters of this genre such as Harrier Attack, you can see just how far the developers have managed to come and just how much they've managed to eke out of the ZX Spectrum when it came to side-scrolling horizontal shooters. Now, other than the speed of the game and how well it seems to scroll on the ZX Spectrum and just how much is going on in the screen, the level of detail on the sprites is also quite astounding for the ZX Spectrum even later on. There's absolutely no denying that this is one of the better examples of a side-scrolling shooter on the ZX Spectrum, which leaves me with no option at all but to heartily recommend to anyone that wants to play this game, well, to go out and get yourself a copy or even emulate it if you must, because this truly is one of those games where you see the difference between the early days and the later days of a system. So go and try and play it now, and that's Q10 Tank Buster from Zeppelin Games in 1992. For game number 3 in the letter Q, yes, we're going back to 1983 in Quackers, a game released by Rabbit Software. Now everyone back in the day will tell you they had a version of this game, and mostly they were just called Shooting Gallery, and that's exactly what it was, a shooting gallery game. Nice simple early gameplay mechanics where you control a character at the bottom of the screen. This time I'm assuming it's a rifle. What I quite liked about Quackers, however, most shooting galleries, they had a bullet limit, and if you ran out of bullets then it was game over. With Quackers, however, you had 3 lives and a time limit. Now if the time bar ran out, well, you lost a life, but fortunately everything that you'd shot up until that point had still remained off the board. Now there were only 2 levels in Quackers, the first level being a basic shooting range, but if you completed that within the time limit and within the lives that you had, you moved on to the second level, which was called Keep the Turtle Hopping, and quite simply all you had to do was shoot the turtle to make it turn around and not leave the screen, and obviously the more times you shot the turtle the higher your score got. Now of course it's a very basic game from 1983, but it's a high score game, and back in the early days games like this could keep you entertained for hours on end, and not only yourself, if you had a selection of friends round, well, you could all compete to see who could get the highest score. Simple addictive fun, and if you've got an interest in these early shooters, well, Quackers is a decent one to pick up. So I definitely recommend you adding it to your collection if you are a ZX Spectrum collector, and can also recommend you giving it a go if you just want to play the game. And that was Quackers from Rabbit Software in 1983. For our penultimate game in the letter Q, we're going with a question of sport from Elite Software in 1988. And yes, this is another one of those licensed games where they took a TV show from the 80s, this time a sports quiz, and put it onto the ZX Spectrum. Now the TV show had 2 teams of 3, all comprised of sports stars from the 1980s. And yes, you do get to choose your team for this game, but unfortunately all the questions, well, they have to be answered by you. So all the sporting knowledge that the contestants had in a TV show, well, it wasn't quite at your disposal. Unfortunately back then there was no way to give the characters that you had selected an option where they could help you out with the questions. And let's face it, that was probably due to the limitations of the ZX Spectrum and the other 8-bit microcomputers of the time. But does that make it a bad game? Well, no it doesn't, because let's face it, everybody loves a good quiz. And if you're a big fan of sports, then I can't imagine a better quiz game than a question of sport itself. Now of course it does sort of follow the format of the show. It wasn't just a straight quiz. There were various sections to the quiz, such as picture rounds or what happened next rounds, and they tried to fit this into the game as best as they can, and to be fair, they do an okay job, fairly decent anyway. But let me tell you, here in 2021, playing a sports quiz game from the 80s, 1988, you really do need an encyclopedic knowledge of sports in the 1980s to come anywhere close to beating this game. And most especially when it comes to the what happened next round, where the quizmaster will read out a scenario from a topical sporting event and give you multiple choice options to what happened next. So we're not even talking basic quiz questions, we're talking about a scenario that's happened recently that might never make it into the annals of history. So can I recommend a question of sport from 1988 and 2021? Well, only if you're a true sports fan, and probably only if you're a true sports fan from the United Kingdom. And on top of that again, well, only if you're a true sports fan from the 80s as well. It does however have an impressive selection of questions. There's more than one set, I believe there's 4 sets of questions that you can choose from, and each set has multiple questions. So if you are a sports fan, or more specifically a sports historian fan, then at the very least this game could be an academic tool to help you bone up on your 1980s and before that sports history. And that is a question of sport from Elite in 1988. For the last game in the letter Q, we're going with Sega's Quartet from 1986, and quite honestly, I'm saving the best for last this week. Now, although this game was designed for multiplayer, I'm all on my lonesome here, so I'll be playing through this myself for the gameplay. And the reason I say I'm saving the best for last as well, just take a good look at this game. This is a game from 1986 running on a ZX Spectrum, a side-scrolling platforming shooter, and yes, it might not be quite as smooth as what we're used to these days, but in 1986 this was absolutely mind-blowing. Now, it does of course fulfill to the old Spectrum colour clash issue, and the way the developers decided to get round it this time was to make the character sprites white, which quite simply meant that if they ran past any other colour or went into other zone of the screen, then they would turn that colour too, which normally would mean that the character would turn into the colour that was on screen. But cleverly they used a dual layer to this game's colour scheme, which meant that wherever your character was on the screen, you could still make them out clearly because it was the secondary colour that would come through on the character. Now, the gameplay itself was quite simple but highly addictive. You started at the beginning of the level and you had to find the exit, but to get out of the exit you had to kill the boss of that level. And of course, on the way there was many minions that would get in your way and try and kill you before you could defeat the boss. And although the levels themselves weren't that long, they were varied in both aesthetics and gameplay. Levels could range from anything from a straight run from left to right to a complex platforming maze, and the art design also shifted with each level. You had lunar landscape levels, inside industrial levels, and even inside cavern levels. So as you can see, the developers done everything in their power to keep this game interesting both in gameplay and on a visual level. So it's going to be absolutely no surprise whatsoever when I tell you I completely recommend you playing this game. And for a game from 1986, now I do know it's from Sega, so you're expecting a level of quality there, but still, in 1986 on a ZX Spectrum 8-bit microcomputer, this game was something special. So if you get the opportunity to play it, then without a doubt grab this game and play it. And that is Sega's Quartet from 1986. So there you are, my friends, another selection of 5 games from the ZX Spectrum library, and another great selection if you ask me, considering the letter Q didn't have a lot of titles in it, so they done well, the letter Q. But if you want to talk about any of these games, as always, drop down in the comments whether you've played them before, whether you would like to play them, or whether you just think they should be resigned to history and buried deep, whatever you want to do. Now, if you've enjoyed this content, as always, throw me a thumbs up on the way out, because it makes a huge difference to the channel, but more importantly it makes a difference to me too. And of course, if you want to see more of these videos and the other videos that I put out every now and again, well, the subscription button, it's always there, it's always free, and you can always change your mind if I start putting out videos that you don't enjoy anymore. So thank you very much for watching again, and until next time, as always, cheerio!